deep movement of reality that very much kind of wants to come through, wants to move through. That's how I felt like that. It kind of like this whole awakening process was like from the perspective from the self, it may feel like you're going somewhere, but actually it's just this very thorough undoing of the self, so this reality can experience itself fully, like in its totality, and kind of in a very embodied and visceral manner as well, and that can endlessly deepen. So it can actually be here. There's a sense that, for me, there was a sense that now I'm actually here, like whatever this is. It had always somehow been there underneath, but now it's fully here. And the person, or the experience of the person Viivi, in many ways it's gone. Of course the personality is here, but it was very clear that there never was such a thing as in that way, that type of individuated existence. It's not really what it seems to be.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Viivi Jokela. Viivi is an awakening facilitator who had a profound awakening in 2022, which she subsequently integrated in order to reach abiding no-self realization. I find her descriptions of what she calls the natural state to be incredibly accurate, as well as the process by which it can be realized. So it's a real pleasure to bring you my conversation with her today. We speak mainly about what it's like to go through no self-realization, which happened for me early this year, so it's all very fresh and alive at the moment here, as well as other aspects of awakening. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Viivi Jokela. Viivi, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, very happy to have you here. Yes, we were just talking about how I came across your work, and I really am looking forward to speaking with you because I really haven't come across anyone who's clearer on this stuff and how they speak about it. And I mean, it's also impressive in a second language that you're doing a better job than anyone, I think. And yeah, I feel like there's a clarity, I guess is the word. There's a kind of everything I've read that you've written on your website and everything I've heard you say in interviews, it just keeps coming through like this laser beam of clarity. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
Oh, thanks. I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. Because for me, speaking about these things, it's all the time so evident that the words fail always, right. Always. But I'm very glad to hear that it still transmits what it wants to express. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a kind of, or at least what I pick up is a radical sincerity of like a very sincere desire to communicate as best as possible, and for me at least that does the job, even though words can't touch this. So yeah, maybe when I say this, it might be useful to share kind of what words you typically use to language what we're talking about here. Awakening, like what does awakening mean to you, if that's the term you use, and yeah, just to bring people up to speed with what we're talking about.
Right. Yeah. I do use the word awakening. I think it's quite descriptive, although it's also can mean so many things for many different people. But for me, awakening essentially means waking up from this basic ignorance, or you could say the basic obscuration of our true nature, into this pristine clarity of true nature and of the nature of everything, because our true nature is identical with the nature of reality as such. So this clarity is very interesting like that, because fundamentally it's really nothing other than that very power that apparently obscures itself, So I feel reality has his power of obscuration and revelation, and it kind of plays a game with itself like that, so. Yeah. First obscuration and then revelation, usually in glimpses, and then more abiding recognition, and then perhaps like a kind of what I would call full awakening or deep realization. and which means that the root of the ignorance is being accessed and kind of seen through, and then we can talk about abiding awakeness, which eventually then matures something that I would call liberation, or living in this mode of self-liberation, which basically means that everything that our true nature comes in contact with, like every sensation, every thought, all the activity, there's something about it that naturally releases, self-liberates in this presence, in this immediacy, in this timeless clarity. Yeah.
And so for when I was singing your praises before, so the audience kind of knows where I'm coming from. Yeah, part of what I'm pointing to is your ability to speak about every aspect of this, every stage of this path. You seem to be very kind of fully in the liberation, realization. I was going to say part of it, but at that point the path has disappeared. But so at your experience now, you mentioned the kind of obscuration and revelation. Is it? Would you describe it as perhaps like a perpetual revelation, or is that paradigm? Is it beyond? Is your experience? Would you describe it as being beyond the kind of revelation and obscuration paradigm in some sense?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, this kind of primal reality is beyond bondage and liberation, is beyond obscuration and revelation. You kind of go through this journey, and then it can drop in such a fundamental, it's not a level, you could say, it's like a dimensionless dimension that somehow then you can kind of see that every stage, every apparent phase of the process has been always and only this. So that's the primal reality. And there's never been an enlightenment. There's never been enlightenment from that perspective, because those dualistic pairs just collapse into something that's so hard to talk about. I like the word suchness. Like suchness, it has something to it that somehow transmits the quality of just this ineffable, what we can never say what it is. It's so indeterminable and so ungraspable and unfixed, and yet at the same time so self-evident. Is like the most evident thing that is ever occurring, and that's the case for everyone, like for all sentient beings, whether enlightened or unenlightened. It doesn't make one little difference from my perspective.
No, I find that word suchness resonates as well. I often use the word non-conceptual, which is a very dry way of, but I think quite accurate in that it's concepts that reified concepts is what seems to create the trouble, the obscuration, the thinking reality is anything other than this unnameable, whatever this is. And so with this kind of revelation aspect, so I've heard you speak about Kevin Shanlick's work, who I've got benefit from following his work as well. And he works with this Theravadan fetter model of 10 fetters, chains of kind of bondage to suffering that can be broken. And if we use that map, I'm currently relatively recently post eighth fetter, which is the kind of abiding no self state. But then so now I'm in the ninth fetter, which is restlessness, which is this kind of as if like uncorking a champagne bottle, like the fundamental issue has been resolved, the cork is out, the self is gone, but then all the fizz gets to kind of come out until it settles down, and then the 10th being this kind of this almost like the beliefs behind that restlessness, that you can get to anything other than this moment, that you can get to some kind of controllable, satisfactory, permanent, something. And I've heard you speak about those two fetters falling as well to where you're at now, but also about how the conditioning, like, because that's what this restlessness is, right? Is conditioning in the body coming out. The conditioning continues to kind of self-liberate and come up to be released. And I guess that's the subtlety. I guess I was interested in exploring about revelation, because it's hard to say at this point. Yeah, like I guess I agree that thing about the paradigm being beyond revelation and obscuration, because I guess it's like as soon as something comes up, it's immediately released. So it doesn't really feel like a revelation. It just feels like a liberation, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The revelation definitely, as a term, it has a kind of specific flavor to it that doesn't really reach well this place, which is really so so basic and also so mysterious. And like you talk about dropping the eighth feather, and I don't know how it was for you, but for me that was almost the opposite of a like revelation. It was almost like a if you have this I am realization, then you kind of unrealize that and there's no one doing that. But it's kind of, for me the predominant kind of emotional tone was just this total bewilderment. I was like, what just happened? It's like, this is very, very different than anything I kind of experienced prior to that. And at the same time, it was so familiar and it was so clear that this was kind of the key to everything. But it's not really insight in the same way, like recognizing the non-conceptual I am presence, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. The no self for me had a similar flavor where I've not really spoken about this in public because it only happened a month ago, and I'm waiting for things to kind of settle a bit, 'cause it's but yeah, it's so funny because it's like something dropped that you can't put your finger on, because it's like the ability, that reflexive cognitive mechanism of self that interrogates it, like that's the thing that dropped. So there's no like, there's just the appearances, and yeah, it's like a kind of it's like the problem fell away. And so that has a very different flavor to revelation. It's like, oh, the problem isn't here anymore, or the problem maker, or the one who thinks we need to solve something, we need to get somewhere, we need to seek something. And so for me, it was really, I think I'd front loaded a lot of very deep emotional, like unburdening. And when that happened, it felt very light and just like unbelievably simple. The appearances are the appearances, and there isn't a secondary thing creating a problem. And then, yeah, that's why it's funny with the restlessness as well, because now there's lots of conditioning coming up, but it doesn't feel like a problem. In the past, it would have very much felt like this needs to resolve, this needs to end, and that seeking, yeah, and that's what I meant about the path disappearing. It's like that comes to an end, but yeah, it feels like I guess I'm feeling into your abiding experience now. Yeah, and I guess when you said about abiding awakeness, like the paradigm of revelation and obscuration is almost like asleep and awake, and so with abiding awakeness there's no asleepness to kind of to wake up from, so it makes sense that you wouldn't use the word revelation for that. But in your experience now, how does conditioning kind of show itself, and what's that process like?
Right. Yeah, for me also, there was some deep conditionings that surfaced after the I am feather dropped away. So the restlessness was kind of intense for me. I also had some really powerful Kundalini experiences and activity going on, kind of like in waves for probably about 2 years. And I can still experience some of that, but there was all the time some sort of deep harmonization that kept happening. And also some deep balancing with this total void, empty nature of reality that also became so salient with the no self shift. And I would say the conditioning, it just started to feel so uncomfortable. Like for me, the no self shift is pretty much identical with truth. That's kind of like when the last subtle untruth falls away. And there are still these subtle beliefs left, but now you are really kind of very, very clearly kind of seeing through the main illusion, the fundamental illusion that was operating there, which was the I am illusion. And that kind of allows a type of unbuffered and unfiltered sensorial experience. So then when a fixation is moving through, or conditioning is somehow starting to make itself kind of knowable in the system, or it starts to activate, it just feels so uncomfortable because it's not in alignment, I feel, with that movement of reality, that natural, non-conceptual, deep movement of reality that very much kind of wants to come through, wants to move through. That's how I felt like that. It kind of like this whole awakening process was like from the perspective from the self, it may feel like, you know, you're going somewhere, but actually it's just this very thorough undoing of the self, you know, so that reality can experience itself fully, like in its totality, and kind of in a very embodied and visceral manner as well. And that can endlessly deepen. So it can actually be here. There's a sense that, for me, there was a sense that now I'm actually here, like whatever this is. It had always somehow been there underneath, but now it's fully here. And the person, or the experience of the person Viivi, in many ways it's gone, you know. Of course the personality is here, but it was very clear that there never was such a thing as in that way, that type of individuated existence. It's not really what it seems to be. I don't know if this answers to your question.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and also
and some of
sense...
these conditionings that show up, they are so, I think, universal, like we all share them. There can be these trauma responses like fawning or pleasing, or still some validation seeking going on, or still searching for safety from the relational field, something like this. But it's felt in a very, very different way now when the experience is so non-dual and kind of just pure energy. And at least for me, it was very hard to really kind of articulate what was going on, like right after the no self shift. For quite a while, it was so immersive. And I got to know about the unfettering work of Kevin Shenelek maybe a couple of years after I had the shift, I think. So it took quite a while. And that was the first model that really addressed the shift in a like very pragmatic manner, and in a way that really helped me to process my own kind of trauma further at that point. Of course, it's also clear that no one is doing it. The doership is completely gone. There's no agency. It's not my trauma in any possible way, and it never was. So it's very paradoxical somehow.
Yeah, it's interesting that you're describing those kind of, I guess, relational coping mechanisms and like trauma responses and stuff remaining, because I guess I what I realized after the no self shift was that I'd unconsciously had certain expectations about it that weren't accurate, and it was to do with perhaps a kind of an ultimate resolution of certain patterns and conditionings, and so like unpleasant feelings wouldn't. I couldn't really. I didn't have these explicit beliefs, but yeah, there was some expectation that, like, I guess you would be like an entirely untraumatized person or something, or someone who doesn't have these coping mechanisms, and it just turns out that's not it. You know, that's all still in the body, and it can come up, and it's but there isn't there isn't the one who thinks it's a problem for it to come up, or and there isn't the struggle and the trying to manage it. It happens, it moves through, and it's fine. And I think this I guess this is a really important point, that like this path isn't about becoming a perfect human being who's like entirely just perfect in some way. And I think that can creep into a lot of spirituality, that there's kinds of images of perfection. But for a lot of people, they use the word kind of liberation from suffering. Is that the language you would use for what this is all about?
Right. So I definitely agree with you about the idea of perfection that can so easily associate with the no self shift, or with the idea of this type of deep realization, and it's really nothing like that. Like this perfection at the human level, it becomes almost like a non-issue, because it's only a sense of self that would be interested in such a thing in the first place. So when that's not there, it's kind of like there's no interest in enlightenment. There's no interest in having to appear in a certain enlightened or perfected manner. But those conditionings can still be deep. And a lot of spirituality, I think it can be about escaping the humanness. So there can be this underlying kind of almost like hope that that's what the enlightenment will bring, is some sort of permanent escape from the messiness of humanness. And so it's almost like the opposite. Because when you have this deep realization, it actually allows this unconditioned nature to in a really beautiful manner to come into harmony with the natural humanness, I would say. So there is that type of healing and integration and unification, that's possible, but that's not going to look like in any particular way. It's not going to look like spiritual necessarily at all. It's a very, I would say, intimate experience. And yeah.
Yeah, no, that's so well said.
But you were asking about the end of suffering, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I would say the suffering can be quite intense in certain ways with the ninth feather, with the restlessness, although it's not suffering at all in any conventional way at that point, because it's not personal anymore, and that's very clear. And there's not that type of conceptualization happening. So, and that's, at least for me, was what I consider like the main source of personal suffering is exactly this entanglement with conceptualization. So that's not there anymore. But the restlessness definitely can feel uncomfortable. Can feel uncomfortable. It doesn't necessarily feel just peaceful and blissful, although those can be there as well. I feel this the kind of bliss that doesn't come and go, the kind of peace that doesn't come and go, like the non-relative peace and bliss, that can always be there, even if there is intensity and turbulence and turmoil. But for me, the kind of question of suffering was more that's what changed at that point when I was myself in that phase, working through with the ninth feather, that it just didn't feel a problem anymore. And yeah, eventually when it then settled, I remember that there was just this interesting moment that then I started to feel almost like that something is not here again, like so many times before, but this was a little bit different, that something is again different. Something has dropped in a very subtle way. I can't even locate the exact moment when it dropped, but and then it's the suffering in a very specific way. And I think that's the 10th feather, because it's very similar for me how it happened, at least how Kevin describes it, that it's now no fireworks, it's nothing spectacular. It's almost like, oh, wow, that's what it was, and now it suddenly makes sense, the expression that this is the end of suffering. So sometimes I use it now myself, even though in the past I didn't actually like that expression, because I think it was too much trying perhaps to sell awakening as a way to escape the suffering. And I don't think that's very useful for someone who's in the process of awakening. I think it's very, very like what's really, really supports this process is to be interested in reality for the sake of reality, to be interested in truth for the sake of truth. And then the suffering will take care of itself if this is your genuine motivation. So that's why I didn't like that expression, because I felt there was too much emphasis around that. But I think it makes sense. And it's kind of like a funny thing. You can never really explain it, because you also see that the suffering, it never really actually happened the way we think it happened. Only at that point, it kind of becomes very, very clear, this non-arising nature, that nothing actually ever rises, so nothing never ceases. and it's a little bit the same with the sense of I am. That's at least how it was for me when I tried to track it initially. Like I was like, I think I died. And then for a while I was like, I should try to locate the moment, when that happened. Right. I should try to locate when did the I cease. And then it was very interesting, because I attuned with it, with the sense of I. And then I tuned, and I was like, well, it was actually never really there. So it actually didn't cease, it was, how do you even explain that? It's impossible, but it can't be realized.
I mean, I think I guess the nature of, you could say, like the dream or whatever, is like imbuing things with a sense of substance and like thingness, like solidity. And so you feel like the self is this solid thing, and then once it's gone, you look back and it was clearly just a kind of mental formation, a bunch of mental formations, like a story that petered out. And so with that assumption there was a thing that came to a definitive end, you look back at it, or you can find a threads of a story that slowly or I mean, it happened kind of suddenly in a sense, but even there, you can't find the instant, the millisecond, because there isn't actually a core that kind of falls away. But yeah, I absolutely love what you said about the end of suffering because it really resonates because I think the idea, I think if you say to someone early on in this path, this is about the end of suffering, what that can do is set up a finishing line. And even though that finishing line kind of does exist, seeking is the energy of the separate self. And so that it could really undermine the the whole project really to really be like, unless until I've broken the 10th fetter or until that's fallen, like this isn't it. Like I'm not there. Whereas yeah, the way I think about it is kind of it's always about opening to experience here in this moment. And so when you said like the pursuit of truth or reality, like yeah, I would say opening is that quality of opening up to what's experientially true right here, right now. And that to me, that's always the wise orientation to move in, whether you're entirely new to this stuff and you just take a moment of mindfulness to kind of open up to what's truly here instead of being distracted. If you feel a pull towards harmony, then that opening in the present moment is the path in my opinion. And if you do that authentically, that can take you the whole way to yeah, the stuff that we're talking about. But I think that's a more effective way to orient from this present moment instead of kind of anchoring to the end of suffering. And I think also suffering as a word can give people the feeling that like pain will never arise. So like you know, if you had like a really severe physical injury, it could still be pain and it won't like feel nice, but there is a like with the restlessness, in the weeks after first I had a kind of a honeymoon period of like a week after the no self shift, and then the restlessness came on incredibly strong. And when the conditioning was coming up, I remember thinking like I can't tell right now if I'm suffering immensely or not at all. Like it's like there's this huge conditioning of like it feels like this is what I used to call like really intense, like unpleasant feelings, but there's this buffer of just completely impersonal okayness all around it. That's just so it's like yeah, it's really it felt like I guess both and or neither. So even there, like there's a sense I guess of like even when there's pain or discomfort, there's not an extra pushing and pulling on it. It's like okay, well like this will end when it ends, and it's here right now, and like it would be delusional to think another reality is possible in this moment than what's here right now.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I can relate to that experience. That like, wow, is this some really intense suffering? And then feeling into it is like it's like nothing
Yeah.
because the sensation is always there. And yeah, it's very hard to even like how do you even work with that? That was for me quite a while, like a kind of I felt that there is something further to go, and at that time I didn't know about the fetters, and I didn't really have much guidance. Like I went through most of my path on my own, so at that point I was again in this phase where I was mostly on my own and I had no idea. And kind of everyone that I had been receiving feedback had told me that this is it, this is completion, like you're
Right.
awake basically. Like, and I'm like, yes, there's definitely that I can sense that this is full awakeness. It's very clear, but I felt that there's further. And for me, this further has been really a blessing because it allowed me to discover like incredible nuances and depths with the post realization journey. That at least for me, it wasn't just one thing at all. It's like many phases, like the terrain. It keeps on going almost like endlessly, I think. So
Yeah.
so yeah, I kept looking into that sense of uh, yeah, restlessness is a good word for it. Like rising, something is like still rising up apparently against, like, but at the same time there is this that nothing is really struggling anymore. There is um, kind of incredible no trace quality, right? Like after the no self shift, the no trace quality, it really starts to uh, make itself known in the experience. So everything is just so fresh, like so fresh,
Yeah.
and you can just tap into it at any moment. The transparency, the vividness, and luminosity, and even suffering. Then it's like, oh, this feels like suffering, but if I really feel into it, I can always tap into the luminous nature of it. So, and for me, that could even be felt like in a type of ecstatic manner. And I think what can also make a big difference at this phase of the journey, if it hasn't arisen earlier on the path, is a motivation that it's something that's beyond yourself. Of course, if you had the no self shift, there's not any more personal motivation really going on, but then it can almost feel like, okay, there's nothing to do, there's no liberation, there's no awakening, it's just reality. But there is something really beautiful if this kind of natural inclination or desire to be of service arises, that you kind of, at least for me, it felt like actually now this makes sense. It was never about me, this whole process to begin with. It was more like getting into this place where I can more be of service in whatever that means, in whatever way that means, because I still don't know like what that means, but I know that my life is not about me and it never was about me. And for me, that gives a kind of some sort of a sense of a golden thread that runs through my life, this act of self-giving. So what first seemed like a loss of all self can also be experienced as a constant act of self-giving. Like that's how this reality, this fundamental reality with its luminosity and vividness and aliveness is constantly giving itself to itself in the form of an experience. So it's like unconditional love, but it's not a feeling, it's not an emotion, it's not a state, it's not an experience. It's like love that is identical with truth. So
yeah, I think what you're saying now is again the kind of stuff that I find quite rare that people point to, because you can find people who are definitely in the no self territory. And I've seen you speak about this as well, that it's kind of odd that some people will get fixated in the absolute in a way that seems like very kind of undesirable from any perspective in terms of a kind of, I guess, like a nihilistic pushing away the world. It feels like to me, it feels like a kind of a final holdout for some conditioning of like the self to try and not do what you're pointing to, which is a return to the relative, a return to the conventional from this new no place. And to me that is the kind of where this leads, and totally makes sense. But what are you familiar with this phenomenon of, I guess, people not going the whole way in terms of that return to the relative?
yeah, I think it's a kind of a pitfall there. And for some, I've done like so many of the pitfalls on the path, and I think that can also be of benefit if you happen to then become a teacher at some point, because that actually is something useful then if you've done the pitfalls.
Definitely.
But that specific pitfall of fixating on the absolute like that, for some reason, I just was not doing that. I don't know why, but I just instinctually felt all along that this is not a place to try to, in any kind of subtle way, to find a new position. And I didn't really feel any need for that also. For me, it was so powerful, this movement, like kind of like falling in love with a relative. Like it was really this act of tremendous heart opening. And yet there was this phase where there was still like a subtle distinction for quite a while, like a subtle. It was very clear for me that the absolute and the relative, they're not two, and it was absolutely fascinating for me. But there was a slight still something there, which I could only then see when that completely collapsed. So I had a very specific moment when I really felt like it's almost like if the absolute and relative, I've heard this metaphor from Zen, but I like it a lot, that if there would be like two arrows shooting against each other, and then they meet like right top to top, and they both are annihilated in that meeting. And it was incredible. It was almost like kind of like a sense of mystical union, okay, when I had this experience and insight. But after that, it was very different. Like there was no distinction whatsoever anymore. There was this amazing like indivisible nature to the reality, and it was completely gone, like any kind of even a subtle way of holding that perspective, because the absolute, it can be experienced as a perspective, and I think that's what's happened with if you end up like kind of fixating on it, that then it can kind of solidify to a type of perspective that we use then in a little bit rigid manner, maybe in the midst of a relative life or relational situations, which actually are asking from us this very organic and spontaneous functioning of realization. No view, no thinking, no understanding, but this organic responsiveness which becomes available with the realization. When the absolute really starts to inhabit the humanness, like the relative, it can actually move around and talk and act and be here in a way that it's really indescribable, because it's not mediated by concept, it's not, there's no thinking, and that's the spontaneous quality, I think, of the realization, that also has like endless capacity for deepening, as this subtle condition that we've been discussing keep like melting and releasing themselves.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Yeah, I think that the way you described it is, if someone's saying, well, like, this is the message, this is the truth, and your languaging of reality is incorrect, like that kind of rigidity, I think, is what we're describing here with the fixation in the absolute, and then the kind of that becoming, just being the realization, and then use language however makes sense. In any particular moment, not having any attachments to, like, oh no, these are the words I use to describe ultimate reality, and like I could probably say, anything about it in different contexts. There is no, I guess you see that as well with the words. They're empty of any inherent meaning. So like you just use them as skillfully as possible, instead of having a fixed kind of way of thinking about or viewing this stuff. And you mentioned that no trace quality before as well, which is, I think, if there's an aspect that there's in me the most gratitude for, perhaps it's that, like, kind of the kind of eternal frame reset of experience, just kind of leaving no trace from moment to moment, because it feels just like it makes it utterly untouchable and untaintable and like uncorruptible, like eternally kind of washing everything away in like a kind of the most like forgiving. It feels like grace, I guess. It's and just unbelievably beautiful as well. And I was thinking, I was reading something a while ago about some philosophers talking about whether beauty is like a kind of a core, the universe like has this striving towards beauty, which isn't typically how I think of this stuff, but it made me think of like kind of what is beauty, because beauty seems to not go away. Beauty seems to be irreducible. It seems to just kind of become more and more obvious. And I guess if I had to put words to it, I might say like beauty is maybe like the aesthetic dimension of openness, of like this openness to reality just expressing to itself, and the way that shows up in our kind of perception, I guess we call that beauty, when there's that openness and that connection. But I think, is that your experience of beauty being a kind of something that doesn't go away?
The beauty, I think for me, has been one of the like prime kind of fascinations with this whole journey, because it really opens up tremendous beauty. Again, it's almost like all these things like truth and love, freedom, beauty, they all seem to be just names for reality, right? or they're not even qualities, but you could experience reality as truth or as love, freedom or beauty, but it's a little bit different flavor, right? When we are like really going into this aesthetic and creative power of reality and exploring it through that. I used to study actually in university. It's called the theory of rasas, and that's based on the Hindu philosophy on enlightenment. So it's a kind of like theory of aesthetics that is alignment with this non-dual view, and kind of uses art and aesthetics alongside the awakening and liberation process, you know, as a way to really kind of empower the path. And there they talk about the 9 basic emotions and how those emotions can kind of in right conditions, in mystical experiences or in artistic kind of situations, they can kind of transform into this, what they call flavor, like for example, the emotion that we would usually call grief or sadness, it can transform into this like tragic rasa flavor of life, and it can be so beautiful, even it's so like heartbreaking, you know, and the same with all the other emotions. So I think that's a beautiful way to look at it, because it also acknowledges the power of our emotions and how that can be also part of the life lived from self-liberation. They are not really human emotions anymore. I feel that personal quality from the emotions, when that drops away, it's sometimes really hard for me anymore to say like anything about the emotions or even name them. But I can feel sometimes when there is this quality of rasa, that like a specific emotional flavor, it's really blossoming into this universal expression, and it's just ecstatic and beautiful, and but I could never communicate it other than just trying to express it through poetry or just dance, you know, and it's enough. And it's yeah, I like to talk about it sometimes, because also there can be these ideas about no self, that it's some sort of a dry place where it's just like, oh, there's no world, there's nothing,
Right.
there's no desire, and it's not just emptiness, okay? And there's nothing wrong with that if that's the main flavor of the realization. It has its own beauty, but um, there is also a type of desire which can express itself like the desire to be of service, or just the desire for reality to kind of fall in love with itself, you know, which is not anymore that type of craving desire which falls away with awakening. And yeah, that
Yeah.
can be a source of inspiration then.
I think that that difference between craving and the desire, the desire coming from a place of no self, is a really important distinction, because I think people don't often point in the way that you're pointing, because I think there can be a kind of anxiety unconsciously about if one lacks confidence in one's like understanding of this terrain, then there could be a kind of anxiety about being misperceived when you're talking about this desire, is that like, oh, actually you're still just clinging, you're still just, you're attached, and you know, and there's wisdom there too, in that the person who's touching into the no self stuff, to get there, one might want to open up to, well, what if it is total emptiness? What if it is total loss? You know, on an emotional level, like, can there be an okayness with that? But then from there, and not, so I guess not using what we're talking about here as a bypass, to be like, emotionally, I don't have to fully let go, because actually there will be some engagement afterwards. Um, but yeah, I guess something I'm becoming increasingly interested in is I feel like in religious traditions of the past that talk about this terrain, there was a level of skillfulness that had emerged around it, around kind of, you know, perhaps beginning with ethical practices, or like, you know, as you said, even like artistic traditions being incorporated, and a kind of just a skillful human packaging of this stuff, so that people don't go off the rails and spin out into nihilistic, or like falling into these pitfalls. And I feel like there's a kind of a rediscovering of these states from an authentic experiential place now, which is wonderful. But I think as a result, people can become unmoored from the kind of skillful stuff you were talking about, and get fixated in different places. So I guess, yeah, I'm really interested in if there are practices that can be added to kind of help people come into a place of flourishing, I guess, post no self, instead of a place of kind of empty, like nihilistic, fixated, like, yeah, disconnect. And poetry for me, like, really, I started writing poetry a lot, like the last couple of years, and I used to read poetry as a teenager, and then I never wrote it in my adult life until I got kind of deep into this kind of stuff, and then I started just writing about it a lot, and it just felt, it's still one of the most kind of, one of my favorite ways to spend my time, because it just feels like a really active engagement with that fascination, with the beauty, the awe, just all these different aspects of this thing that doesn't really have different aspects. And yeah, I loved reading your poetry on your website. So I think that I had a conversation recently with Henry Schuckman, who's a Zen teacher, and he was talking about how in Zen, kind of art is a very crucial part of the tradition because it's about this invitation back into the relative world instead of leaving it behind. But yeah, I'm just saying this to really agree with with what you said. And we've spoken a lot about the kind of post no self stuff, but you've written about the kind of stages of awakening. It might be good to touch on that, and particularly maybe the kind of the challenging aspects like the dark night, because in my case, there was, I guess it was like, James didn't make the decision to go through that part of the terrain. There was just this like deep somatic pull of like, the system needed to go there. And so for James, the solution was kind of unpleasant, and kind of there was plenty of times where it was kind of kicking and screaming and being like, why the heck do I have to go through this? And that can be, if you're trying to communicate this stuff to someone who's coming from the self paradigm, that can be and they think the self is in control. There can be this thing of like, okay, well, like, do I go on this journey or not? Like, if myself won't enjoy it, but the self's an illusion, and yeah, so it's like, I guess my instinct is listening out for that sincere, authentic pull that comes from somewhere from beyond the self. But yeah, I wonder what you would like to share about those issues.
About the dark nights, or
yeah, whatever resonates around the kind of stages, the dark night,
yeah,
what pulls you on this path.
yeah, yeah. For me also, I didn't choose to go there. I felt like my character was kind of removed from the production that I thought was my life.
Yeah.
And then I was just left in this yeah, very somatically also very challenging dark nights. So, and I think I don't know if it's even possible, to really be prepared or to really choose to go there, because it's kind of like the nature of that more immature self that has just maybe got the first taste of enlightenment and is still like on that kind of naive phase of the journey. How could that, when I look at least back to myself, how could that version of Vivi ever could have had any kind of intuition or maturity to comprehend where this was going, or to be prepared for that, or to go there? Of course not. That needed to die. When I look at it back, it needed to be sacrificed for this process to go further. Yeah, the dark night is a lot about surrender, is a lot about the personal will being like to really coming in an experimental way in touch with the limitation of that aspect of self, which is very energetic and primal, which is not necessarily a narrative or self-image, but it's just this will, this will, like my life, what I want, what I don't want.
Yeah.
And it's so necessarily, and it's such a powerful period. It's so transformative, but it is also kind of tremendously devastating in so many ways. I think Daniel Ingram's work, can be useful. I only found that afterwards, but for some people it's useful to get some sort of like map for it, or some sort of at least intellectual understanding about what's going on, or some practical advices like what's supporting it and what definitely doesn't support it. So that I sometimes recommend to people. But it's also very like an invitation to this type of contemplative period of life where you accept that, okay, nothing is really apparently happening. You're really kind of forced into this, what for mind appears like boredom, but it's actually just stillness. And so you just kind of can also, I think that would be maybe like a more mature way to approach it, is to just accept that, okay, life is asking me to enter into this type of more like a mystical contemplation, even if there's no spiritual inclination or that type of sense to it, but at least in an existential manner, like I'm being asked to really be with myself in a kind of very raw and honest and sincere manner, and maybe question everything, like question all my previous ways or my previous answers maybe that I had, or look at the way that I've been deceiving myself until this point. So it's a kind of fierce grace, the dark night, so it doesn't feel like that necessarily, but it will, like, you just have to go all the way through with that. Like, that's the only way, like, not 99%, but it has to be 100%. And then it's going to look very, very different afterwards, like what it all was about. And at least for me, I can see it was so necessarily. I don't think the awakening would have the type of depth that it has, like, without the dark night. I really think that they're inseparable, like, actually, like, all this trauma and woundedness and apparent darkness or unconsciousness in our being, then to this tremendous, like, beauty and illumination and insight and inspiration. They are literally like two sides of the same phenomenon. Or we could say that it's like the lotus that is growing from the mud. It's like you can't remove it from the mud in any actual manner, or you can, but it would lose completely the reality of what that beauty of that lotus is, like the miracle of that flower. That's where it's thriving, all its life vitality, from that apparent dark material that it's being kind of transmuted in that period of time. So there's definitely, like, deep transformation that takes place at this relative level. Of course, when we then have the absolute realization, and there's no transformation, there's no arising, no ceasing, but that doesn't, in my perspective, it doesn't need to contradict that on this embodied level of the journey, we go through periods of transformation, which makes this very interesting.
Yeah, I think, that transformative quality is important to emphasize, because it's coming to me now, I guess, a combination of metaphors where, like, I think the caterpillar to butterfly is a useful one. And but I guess it's like with the initial awakening, it's like you're a butterfly who's dreaming they're a caterpillar, and then they wake up and realize they're a butterfly, and they've always been a butterfly, but then they fall back into the dream, and the only way out is for, in the dream, the caterpillar to kind of build the chrysalis and dissolve and become a butterfly, and then they can kind of bring into alignment, I guess, the kind of the psychological misperception with the reality. But so, the initial awakening is like, oh great, I'm a butterfly, I've always been a butterfly, amazing. But then the dark night is like the caterpillar in the dream realizing it's instinctively building this chrysalis, and now it's dissolving, and it's like, wait a minute, like, this is this is the end of me. And so that's that's kind of what I was pointing to, the kind of paradox of, like, to the mind, if someone's asking themselves, should I do this, should I not do this, it's kind of, that isn't really the right way to approach it. It's just, is that instinct there to do this? And then when that process is over, you look back at the chrysalis phase, and it's like, I mean, I feel very lucky that the dark night stuff happened, because it forced a kind of a clearing out of the blockages that were blocking the kind of abiding awakeness. And it seemed so finite. It was like a year and a half or something of really intense stuff. And at the time, it felt like it was going on forever, and it was this kind of awful, like, terrible thing. And then, now it just doesn't seem like such a big deal. And especially that quality of, like, it was all just happening experience anyway. It didn't have the reality it seemed to have. And we're kind of working backwards here, I guess, through the stages. But perhaps, you might say something about the initial awakening. Like, when you work with people now, like, how do you advise people to do self-inquiry, or, like, how do you kind of advise someone who's entirely new to receiving awakening?
So when I interact with people about these things, like awakening, like have discussions or work one-on-one or in a group setting, it's really very much based on the moment, like the spontaneity of the moment, and the what comes up in the moment in their interaction. So like, I could, if someone asks a question, I could give the same, like, a different answer,
Right.
completely different answer for the same question in another moment, even if it would be the same person.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the only way that I'm able to do this, because for me, the memory of the unawakened state, if that even makes sense, it's so gone at this point that I can't really, like, relate to that. Like, for me, it's very hard to understand that not everyone is having that basic recognition, and that's one of the main well, the main kind of team working with people is to come to that abiding recognition. So none of that really makes sense for me, because from my perspective, it's so obvious, and I keep pointing it out again and again and again, the most obvious thing. But what I feel it's much more important than any words that are said or even any pointers that are given is that there seems to happen some sort of like, and I feel it when it happens, like some sort of flow, like there's something moving through or pulsing through and fusing with the environment and with the energy fields of the people that I talk with, and I feel often their processes kind of in a visceral manner, but without necessarily needing to interpret it, or that this feeling means is this feeling or anything, but I kind of feel it. And then I respond to that. And I often try to sense if there's something that is like holding on or something that is fixating, and really intuitively sensing it. And then kind of starting to point towards that, like asking questions from the person so that it becomes more like illuminated for them in their own experience. Something like that. That's really my methodology, which I really don't have other than what seems to be happening. I kind of feel this whole teaching thing also just started to happen on its own. I definitely didn't have any intention or interest for that, but it really just started to happen, and then suddenly I just noticed that, well, that now I'm doing these sessions and I'm having these talks like now with you, and
Yeah, it feels very aligned from my perspective as well. You're transmitting very clearly, so I'm sure there are many people who will benefit. So yeah, thank you for coming here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, James. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.